Today we have the honor of sharing a few moments with Dr. Jane Goodall, whose contributions on chimpanzee research has drawn worldwide acclaim. Your work began over 30 years ago with Dr. Louis Leakey. What would you consider to be the greatest lesson learned through your observations of animals that could shed some light on the present human condition?
Well, I think that what I've learned most during the 30 years, looking back over it, is the fact that the chimpanzees are so like us in so many ways that they have really served, for me anyway, to blur that line that used to be drawn so sharply between humans on the one hand and the rest of the animal kingdom on the other. And it's humbling in a way, because we're not as unique as we used to think. On the other hand, this close study of our closest relatives does also help to pinpoint the ways in which we as a species are unique.
Do you think that people are able to recognize that there is that link, or do we still generally prefer to remain elitist? Are we ready to accept this?
I think a lot of people are getting ready to accept it, but there's still a tremendous intellectual upheaval every time it's demonstrated in chimpanzees or any other animal that they are capable of some kind of intellectual ability that we used to believe unique to ourselves. And I think that's why there is so much controversy over the recent ape language acquisition experiments, where chimpanzees and gorillas are taught, for example, the signs of the American Sign Language, ASL.
But what particular things can you note, can you describe to us that are very similar to human behavioral patterns?
Well, there are many. To start with, there is a long period of childhood dependency on the mother. It's 5 years between live births in a wild chimpanzee family. And I think that that long childhood is very important, as it is for us, in relation to social learning, because the youngster has an awful lot to learn. And while his mother is caring for his basic daily needs, he is free to learn, just as our children are. Then we have these amazing long-term supportive bonds that develop between mothers and their growing offspring, and between brothers and sisters, bonds that last through a lifespan that may be 50 years. Some of the most amazing similarities between chimpanzees and humans, I think, are in the sphere of non-verbal communication. So that chimpanzees, like humans, kiss, embrace, hold hands, pat one another on the back, wave their arms angrily. And these are not only postures and gestures similar to those that we use, but used by the chimpanzees in the same contexts, and quite clearly meaning the same things. Chimpanzees show sophisticated cooperation, for example, in hunting. They are quite successful hunters, and when they've made a kill, they share the prey. And perhaps most fascinating of all are the intellectual abilities of chimpanzees, which, as I say, many of them used to be considered uniquely human capabilities, such as the fact that chimpanzees can reason, they can solve simple problems, particularly using tools, which they do in the wild. They have very good memories. To some extent, they can plan for the immediate future. And their acquisition of human-type languages has shown that they're capable of using, understanding abstract symbols in their communication.
Well, your son was actually raised amongst the chimpanzees. What kind of influence do you think that this has had on him as a human being? Do you think this has made him a better human being?
Well, I think his upbringing was influenced by the chimpanzees in two major ways. First of all, I quite deliberately planned some of my child-raising techniques as a result of watching those of the chimpanzees. I learned a tremendous amount about mothering from watching chimps like the old female Flo. I realized that it's very important for a small child that one uses distraction rather than punishment. That's before the child really can understand what's right and what's wrong. I've learned over the years the tremendous importance for a young chimp of the type of mothering and the type of mother, because this has such a great influence on subsequent adult behavior. And perhaps above all, I watched chimpanzees raising their infants, and I saw what fun they had, what tremendous enjoyment they got out of raising offspring, and I wasn't about to be denied that fun. So I made a conscious decision that I would more or less stop following chimps while my son was small, so that I could be with him, give him the kind of security that I felt was important for him based on my knowledge of the chimps. So in those ways, his upbringing was influenced by the chimps. But I had to keep him very carefully separated from the chimps, because chimpanzees, as I've said, are hunters, and they have been known to take human infants. And I think because he realized that very early in his life, he doesn't like chimps at all.
Oh, really? No, but I think that your observations on the parent-child relationship of the chimpanzees is extremely important for human beings. I think probably today, most people, they get married and they have their child, and after a month of having the baby, the child is put into some sort of daycare center. And I was wondering, have you talked to people about the importance of the early maternal-child bonding? Do you think, one of the reasons that society is going somewhat awry right now because of the separation between the mother and child at such an early age?
I think it's very, very important. And it used to be something I spoke about very frequently. In fact, the very first time I was invited to Japan in 1984 was for a symposium on problems in raising Japanese children, as a matter of fact. And my role was to discuss the influence of early mothering on chimpanzee behavior and see what we might learn from that. And I think what's important for us to realize in the way we raise our children today, we are doing something that's very different from maternal behavior as it evolved during evolution. And we are, in many cases, denying human infants the kind of early environment which evolution has prepared them for, in a way. And because these children today are growing up in modern society, it may be that in some ways this kind of early experience fits them more for modern social life. I don't think so. I believe that it's desperately important for the young human child to be able to establish relationships of trust with the mother or a mother alternative, with 2 or 3 adults who remain constant in the child's early life. And the reason I believe this is that it's so obvious in chimp mother behavior that if you have an infant whose mother is rather non-supportive, a little cold, a little rejecting, then that child will grow up and have great difficulty in forming meaningful relationships with others as an adult. And if that's true for our own children, which I truly believe it is, then this is something that society should be giving a great deal of attention to.
What actually got you involved in this kind of work? I mean, you were working as a film editor before you decided to run off to Africa with Dr. Leakey. What brought you there?
From the very first moment I can remember, I was interested in animals, watched them, animals meaning birds in the garden, insects, anything I could observe in nature, wrote about them, nature notes, drew them, proper drawings showing colors of wings and beaks and numbers of legs and so forth, read books about them. My interest in Africa as such probably began when I read Dr. Dolittle and Tarzan as quite a small child. And from then on, in my mind, I knew I wanted to go to Africa. But of course, in those days, it was not the done thing for young English girls to go off to Africa and study animals in the wild. I had an incredibly supportive, wonderful mother who never said, "No, Jane, that's impossible." She always said, if you want to do something and you work hard and you seize opportunities, you will. So I had that tremendous support. And everything I did until I went to Africa was really filling in time, waiting for those opportunities, but continuing to read everything I could. So that when I finally had this invitation to go out to Africa from a school friend, I left my very fascinating job in London working with documentary films because it wasn't giving me any money. I saved up by being a waitress and living at home, had enough finally for a return fare, and then when I got there I heard about Louis Leakey, went to see him, and the value of all that early self-training was very apparent because he began asking me all kinds of questions about animals. He took me around the museum that he was curator of, and he clearly was impressed because I knew quite a lot about African animals and snakes and birds and all kinds of things. So he offered me a job, and then he began talking about these chimpanzees living on a remote lakeshore. Well, I would have studied any animal. It was just fantastic to be given the one that next to humans is probably the most complex and fascinating in the world.
There was biologist Dr. Lyle Watson once proffered the 100th monkey theory, and you probably know what that... The idea basically is that there was one monkey who accidentally dropped his potato into the salt water, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then it was clean, and it also tasted better. So after this monkey experimented with that, then another one saw and ate that. And after the 100th monkey had done so, then monkeys all around the world all of a sudden were washing their potatoes in salt water. And it was intended as a fable, not really as something that based on scientific fact, but everybody picked up on it, and it became kind of like a slogan for the new age, that there will be a time that if everybody keeps moving and believing in a certain direction, then everything will be transformed automatically. You know, you just have to have that critical point where things will change, and then the change takes place. But where do you draw the line between what is culturally transmitted and what is biologically inherited? How does what are your observations on that, especially with the chimpanzees?
I think that there's no question of doubt that for chimpanzees, just like humans and all the other higher mammals, learning does play quite an important part in the individual life. It's equally indisputable that heredity plays an important role as well. There used to be such scientific controversy over the nature-nurture argument, but mostly that's settled down now, and most biologists believe that there's a mixture of the two. As the brain gets more complex, as with chimpanzees and humans, then the learning part of it plays an ever more important role. And in our own species, for example, cultural evolution has to a large extent taken over from physical evolution. Even in chimpanzee society, we see the beginnings of cultural evolution, in that chimpanzee populations in different parts of Africa have completely different cultural traditions. And you can imagine, for example, that when you have the hammer and anvil tool using technique in West Africa, but not in East Africa, that a West African chimpanzee at some point in the distant past hit upon this new technique for opening hard-shelled fruits, practiced it. The young ones watched, imitated, and practiced, and so the new culture spread through that particular group. Just as with that monkey, that was Emo, and Emo was a Japanese macaque. She was the one who began washing her sweet potatoes in the sea.
If you were to take for a moment the chimps' perspective in observing your behavior during those 30 years that you spent with them, what kinds of patterns do you think they would have noted, and how you changed by being with them over that long period of time?
Well, chimpanzees, fortunately, in the wild, don't imitate humans at all. They do it readily in captivity. That's why they're so good at performing and are used and abused so horrendously in entertainment. But in the wild, they readily imitate each other. They don't imitate human beings at all. And my own behavior, I can't answer that part. How do you mean? I didn't understand the question.
The question is that you spent 30 long years working with these chimps, and you were always observing the way that they interacted. But if you were to look at yourself and the changes that were within you because of your experience with these chimpanzees, how do you think that your own behavioral patterns were influenced by them and changed during that course of time?
I thought that's what you meant, but I don't think they were. I mean, I learned to be a better observer. I could follow them better through the forests. But I think that the same person that went to Gombe in 1960 didn't really change very much. I was doing what I'd always wanted to do, learning from, being with animals.
You don't think that there was anything, and just in terms of your recognition of the chimp's behavior and how similar it was to human behavior, there wasn't anything that began to grow within you that you would then be able to more freely express because you didn't have the constraints of a human society to disallow you from pursuing that maybe instinct that...
I don't think so, because, you know, from the time when I was very small, animals meant a tremendous lot to me. And I grew up understanding that human society wasn't the only important society. And my time with the chimpanzees just served to emphasize that. But I'd always been the same. I knew that we weren't the only creatures in this world that mattered. And when I first went to Gombe, for example, and then returned to Cambridge to work for my PhD degree, I encountered a great deal of opposition to some of the things that I was beginning to write about the chimps. That they had personality, that they had minds, that they were motivated to attain certain goals deliberately. And these things were not scientifically acceptable at that time. The first article I ever wrote for a British scientific journal, I talked about the chimpanzees as individuals, and because they were males and females, I talked about he and she. And the editor returned my manuscript, and all the he's and she's were struck out, and it was substituted, and I got very angry and put back the he's and she's, and they were left. So that, in a way, was the first sort of victory over the then very rigid scientific community.
Yes, I was reading some reviews of your earlier work, and it said that it was acclaimed because of your avoidance of anthropomorphic associations. And I was wondering how possible that really was after knowing them so intimately as individuals and seeing all of the individual variation amongst them. How easy was it for you to present a paper that was not anthropomorphic? And
because I had a great teacher in Robert Hind. He told me how to express myself so that I wouldn't be accused of being anthropomorphic. And I'll never forget him saying, well, look, Jane, you can't prove that a chimpanzee is jealous, but why don't you put, if Fifi were a human child, we would say that she was jealous. And I also learned from him that by explaining the facts very carefully in quite an objective manner, people will draw their own conclusions. They'll be then guilty, if you want to call it guilty, of anthropomorphism. But in fact, we can take this whole discussion about anthropomorphism a whole step further, because chimpanzees are used by medical research because their bodies physiologically are so like ours. They've been used in all kinds of research into the brain because the structure of their brain, the anatomy of the brain and of the central nervous system is so like ours. Genetically, they differ from us by only just over 1%. These things have been very readily pinpointed by those people who want to use chimpanzees to learn about human disease and to search for cures and vaccines. But they have been so reluctant to admit to the equally striking similarities in behavior, in emotions, and in intellect. And it stands to reason that if you have a being that differs from us by only just over 1% and has all these striking physiological, anatomical, genetical characteristics shared with us, that you would expect the expression of the emotions to be similar. You would expect the intellectual capabilities to be similar. And yet that, if we talk about those, we're accused of being anthropomorphic.
So how do you deal with that situation publicly and in the scientific community? Do you try to enforce your beliefs in some way that is going to be somewhat influential? Do you think that you've been successful in opening up the scientific community to this?
I think that the old hard line was really derived from the behaviorist school which started in America, Watson. And he promulgated the idea that animals were just machines, bundles of stimulus and responses. And this was why some of the horrendous conditions in the labs grew up in the first place, because animals weren't supposed to feel pain. I think even right the way through that era, most people did believe that animals felt pain. And most people did believe that animals had emotions. And you would have scientists going into the lab and putting on their white coats and treating animals in a way that from the point of view of the animal was torture. And those same people going home, taking off their white coats, locking the lab door, and telling people stories about how human-like their dogs were. I think that over the last decade, really, there's been an increase of research into the animal's mind, and that most scientists today are quite prepared to talk about personality, mind, motivation, and that the old split that animals didn't have emotions, didn't have feelings, didn't have intellectual abilities like ours, that's really in the past now.
What is your stance on using animals in experimental situations?
I think we were extraordinarily arrogant in the first place to decide that we could use animals in this way, but not only in medical research, also in the intensive farming, the fur industry, the horrible way we abuse pets. And the whole spectrum of what we do to animals for our own ends is horrific. As far as medical research is concerned, we should be trying much harder to find alternative ways of using any live animals, and they are just around the corner. Many have been found. There's no mechanism at the moment to enforce some new kind of alternative, even if it's been proved to be effective and cheaper than animal research. I think we need some Nobel Prizes for this kind of research. I think it's time that scientists stopped treating scientists who search for alternatives as some kind of people who didn't quite make it in mainstream science. And in the meantime, while animals are still used, because it's not going to stop tomorrow, we ought to be treating them a whole lot better than we do now.
When you go to a zoo, what is the first reaction that you have in seeing these chimpanzees and other animals in cages?
It depends very much on the type of zoo. The old-fashioned cement floor, steel-barred zoo should be done away with. The more modern type of zoo with large enclosures and animals in social groups, with its emphasis on education, is a whole lot better. I prefer that the animals were out in the wild, but we have them now. They're all over the world in countries where they don't belong. Mostly they can't be returned to the wild, so we have to look after them. And a really good zoo is one way of caring for the animals that we have in captivity and trying to spread the word about how wonderful are some of these other beings with whom we share the planet.
Do you think that until there is this consciousness of our relationship with the other animals on the earth, that there will be no way of trying to save Gaia? Are we reaching an end here?
I'm very encouraged by the changing attitudes towards animals and the environment too, of course, around the world, particularly among the young people. I think we're raising a generation now that will not go into labs and do the kind of things that our generation has done to animals. I've been very encouraged by the attitude of African governments to conservation. And there are those who say, well, they only want to conserve because they believe that that's going to bring in some foreign exchange. Of course they've got to think that way. They wouldn't be very good rulers of their own people if they weren't trying to bring in foreign exchange, because most of these countries are very poor. And if we're going to expect a government in a poor country to set aside a large area of forest for chimpanzees, gorillas, elephants, and all the other amazing creatures that live there, then there must be some alternative for them, as opposed to selling off the timber to the West or clear-cutting it for their own people to cultivate. And so it's terribly important for anybody who cares about conservation to try and encourage donor countries to put money into rural development schemes, agroforestry programs, to provide some conservation education programs, some health care, to develop controlled tourism so that the habitat isn't destroyed by an abundance of visitors. And above all, to remember that these are sovereign countries, they're proud people, and the only possible way that a conservation project is going to work is if the people perceive it as theirs.
You were in Japan to receive the Inamori Foundation Kyoto Prize. Why do you think that you've been chosen at this particular time to receive this, and what would you like to convey to the Japanese people?
Well, I'm still wondering why I was chosen. I feel that it's a tremendous honor. And I'm also tremendously grateful because there's no question but that it will increase my credibility around the world, talking with heads of state, trying to create changes in public awareness towards chimpanzees and other animals around the world. Another reason why I find this Kyoto Prize particularly meaningful is that Japan, in a way, started primatology. It was Professor Imanishi in the early 30s who began watching monkeys and writing about them here in Japan. And he started the great school of Japanese primatology with his students, Professor Itani and Professor Kano. And they, with their students, such as Professor Nishida, who's now conducting the second longest term chimpanzee project in the world, also in Tanzania, incidentally. And so it was particularly meaningful to me to be given this prize in Kyoto, which is the center of Japanese primatology, and surrounded by some of the people who've contributed more to our understanding of chimpanzees and more to the conservation of chimpanzees in Africa than anybody else that I know.
It's kind of an interesting the Japanese are supposed to be the environmental destroyers of the world, and yet at the same time, their conservation of the primates is probably the most profound in the world. Do you have any comment on this apparent paradox? Or?
Well, I think that the Japanese monkeys clearly occupy a very special position in the heart of the Japanese people. Japan does indeed have a bad name internationally as regards the destruction of the environment, particularly today because of whaling, so-called research whaling. But I've had, as I've had everywhere else in the world, a very strong feeling that there is great change coming in Japan. I've seen, for example, that some of the major corporations are now putting environmental concern up at the top of their list. And certainly speaking with a lot of young Japanese students, they have a real growing concern for many different kinds of animal and environmental issues. In fact, you know, in some ways, as I was talking to some of my Japanese friends yesterday, I can see Japan turning around and leading a world environmental battle to try and heal some of the wounds that we've inflicted around the world on this poor planet of ours.
In Japan, as you were mentioning before, there is around-the-clock observation of the monkey troops here. And whenever there's a change in the political structure, and it's reported in the newspapers. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the hierarchy of the chimpanzees.
Yes, one of the most fascinating aspects, actually. They live in a very clearly male-dominated society, and among the males there are those who stand out from quite an early age in that they are incredibly highly motivated to better their position in society, in male society. And every single male who's made it to the top, and they last an average of 5 to 10 years in that top position, has achieved that position by a different method. It's usually not the large, aggressive heavyweights who make it to the top. There's only been one like that, and he only lasted 18 months. It's usually the smaller males who are characterized by a certain level of intelligence, as well as motivation and drive, who make it to the top. One, for example, incorporated empty kerosene cans from my camp into this magnificent charging display that the male performs, and he's trying to intimidate his rivals, making a lot of noise, dragging branches, hurling rocks, swaying vegetation, avoiding conflict in that way. And Mike learned to use up to 3 of these cans in these displays, made it to the top in 4 months. As far as we know, he didn't have to fight at all. Another male, Figan, who made it to the top, had a very close relationship with his brother, and he only challenged the larger, heavier, top-ranking male when his brother was there, and then his brother almost always joined him in these displays, and eventually they so wore down the nerve of the top male that Figan plucked up courage and was able to attack and won. And in fact, male chimpanzees will fight more, actually physically fight more in the context of social dominance than any other context. And one is left wondering why. Because unlike males in many other primate species, the top chimp male doesn't have necessarily free access to all the females. He doesn't necessarily sire the most offspring, because any chimpanzee with the right social skills can persuade a female to follow him away from all the other males and keep her on a sort of extended honeymoon in an outlying part of the community range. And if he does keep her there, he can sire an infant, even if he's young, old, or a cripple, just as well as the top-ranking male who's right there in the center of all the action. So we're left feeling that perhaps it's not only in humans that power is important for power's sake.
And the last question. You have been campaigning around the world for animal rights. And I was wondering, do you feel that you are making an impact now?
Well, I think something's beginning to pay off, yes. I've been lecturing mostly in the United States for many years now, doing a certain amount of lobbying on Capitol Hill, talking with senators and congressmen, bringing together people, not only those who are concerned about chimpanzee welfare, but the scientists who are doing research with them and the technicians, bringing them all together to talk. And I think that because I'm perceived as being non-confrontational, but someone who's got a hopefully fairly rational approach to trying to find out what the problem is and how we can solve it, I've managed to have access to people like Secretary James Baker, for example. And his influence has helped me enormously in Africa, has given me access to heads of state in Africa. And this quite clearly is helping in some conservation measures in some of the countries where I've been. There's no question about it. And the more, what do I want to call it, not notoriety, but the more prominence that I can gain through something like this Kyoto Prize, the more easy it is to talk to the people that really matter. But it's been very, very important to establish scientific credibility, to have impeccable papers published that can't be, written off as a whole lot of hot air. And certainly I propose to devote the rest of my life to this battle.
Well, thank you very much.